Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. Looking forward to a very lively session with some very interesting people, a lot of experience in the FTTH industry. What we're going to be talking about today is the best practice for approaching FTTH funding, and specifically how to turn a lot of the normal impediments and difficulties in an FTTH deployment to your advantage as you start to look at getting funding for new areas. We will have Q&A at the end of the session today. So if you have the ability, click on the Zoom interface to submit questions. Great set of panelists today. I'll go from the far right to the far left for introductions. Bill, would you mind introducing yourself to the team here?
Yeah, my name is Bill Fleming with a small consulting firm called Echo Labs. We're currently engaged with Live Oak Fiber down in Florida and Georgia on a mega project. I come to the whole fiber to the home and the broadband industry really from a early career in major infrastructure projects, primarily on kind of the program construction management side. For about the last 25 years, I've been involved in building broadband projects all over the world. Big projects in Europe where we were upgrading traditional cable networks, coming back to the States with helping Media One get ready to sell their network, and then of course being involved with the rollout of Live Oak Fiber.
Well, thanks for that intro. And he's being a little bit modest. Bill's also very involved in some of the application layer stuff that goes on once a network is deployed. So true wealth of experience there. So thank you very much for joining. Mr. Sam Adair, it's a pleasure to have you here. Would you mind introducing yourself to the webinar?
Absolutely. Thank you. My name's Sam Adair. I'm the Director of Customer Success here at Irby Utilities. I come with a little over a decade of experience in the utility world. So I worked at an electric cooperative for 10 years before coming over to the materials and services side of things here for Irby. So, Irby is a turnkey vendor. We do everything from the initial feasibility study, grant writing, operations, inventory, even all the way down to the call center and how we're able to assist our clients, customers with their online experience. And so that's one of the big things that we are really, really pushing here is now that you've got this broadband system or as you are building your broadband system, now what? And that's where Irby's able to help you guys scale as your ISPs grow.
Fantastic. And Harley.
Yeah, Harley Slater here. I'm the product manager at BRE Networks, where I manage our web application Fond, which, if you don't know, uses an automated design approach to assess planning and design in the early phases of your project. I come with 7 years of experience now in the telecommunications industry, and I've, mainly done design and engineering across 4 continents, but mainly in the US.
Thanks. And my name is Russell Agle. I have commercial responsibility for everything we do at BRE Networks. A couple decades in telecom, started off consulting with the large OEMs and have done a variety of cellular startups, spent some time at a fiber cable manufacturer, and more recently have been with Durline and now BRE Networks. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here and look forward to hosting what I think is a pretty interesting and insightful session today. So just to provide a little context, the RVA did one of its periodic surveys, and at the end of last year found that there have been 69 million homes passed by fiber networks to date in the United States. They believe that in the next 5 years, another 60 million homes will need to be passed. Powering that is about $150 billion in funding. The reason I'm bringing this up is to make the point that today's discussion isn't about funding strategies for any single source of money. This is not one on private equity. It's not BEAD specific. Rather, it's the collected experiences of all the panelists to look at what we believe are best practices for any kind of funding request, capital allocation for a fiber to the home network. So these numbers are staggering, and they may be fully true, maybe partially true, but the fact of the matter is this is a very, very robust industry with a lot of activity coming up in the next couple of years at a rate that we have never seen before. So we'll actually lead with the punchline today. And the punchline is, for your funding project of any FTTX deployment, the best thing you can do is to plan your candidate network as thoroughly as possible. Historically, you could almost say that a good plan in fiber to the home or fiber to the curb or whatever it was a bit of an oxymoron. There were so many corner cases, so many specificities going on in the real world that any plan almost fell apart the moment that you start putting a shovel in the ground. I think what we hope to convince and explain to everyone on this seminar today is that the industry has come a long way. And while there will always be rules of thumb about how to approach funding your fiber deployment, planning it, designing it, so on and so forth, there's actually a lot more technology. There's a lot more science now than there was 10, 15 years ago, which means that a good plan should actually continue to pay dividends long after the assets and the funds have been allocated for that deployment. So what we're going to do now is start to look at some of the obstacles. What are the problems? What are these sources of ambiguity that have traditionally existed in a fiber deployment, so that we can sort of give you guys some guidance on the best way to proceed. The good news about fiber is that there are many known unknowns. This has been going on for a long time. And what we have seen is that in general, the three major categories for difficulty, ambiguity, or the issues of planning out a fiber network tend to be people, pathways, and permits. And what we have seen through our own work, as well as the work of our collective partners, ecosystem partners, as well as customers and investors, is that the fiber to the home plans, the fiber to the home funding events that get rewarded the most are the ones that lean into these challenges, that lean into and provide detail and scenarios and detail about these three different categories of obstacles / opportunities in a fiber to the home deployment. So, and this is where we're going to get to learn a lot from our guests who have many decades of experience. So when it comes to people, you know, there's often a lot of discussion about the amount of field resources. Are there enough crews? Are enough people actually doing the work in the field? But that also applies to designing and engineering, and making sure that there are enough people to manage the large scale of proposals and candidate networks that are required to fund all of these. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to Bill, because as we've established at the beginning, Bill has tremendous amount of experience across different technology types, geographies, and service providers. So Bill, I guess very direct question to you is, in your years of experience, has the business development aspect, this planning for fiber networks, has that changed your relationship with engineering and construction companies over the years? What has been the evolution in your approach to this phase of a
As,
network?
as I said earlier, projects would be a lot of fun if you didn't have to worry about people and money. So we're talking generally about the money side of it today, but the people side of it is important. And I want to think back over, say 20 years ago when you got involved in developing mega broadband projects, not necessarily fiber, but mega broadband projects. There was a lot of remote working going on as you develop those projects all over the world,
Right.
drawing expertise together. And the technology to support those remote working teams, has advanced considerably. The pandemic gave it a big boost in the real world. And I think today what you see is you have the ability for you start a big project or you have visions of a big project or one that requires multiple skills. It really is surprising today how much of those activities can be done through various remote working environments. Now, that doesn't get away from the fact that at the end of the day, it takes people on the ground getting shit done. But the reality is the infrastructure to support that, whether your design is being done in 2 or 3 places in the world, coming together in, say, South Florida, or whether the crews that are coming together there are being drawn from all over the country. I think what we see is that there's a tremendous ability today to reach out and find expertise almost anywhere that can be valuable to your project. So the ability to do a small project and draw world-class expertise to help with that is much different today than it was even 10 years ago. And I think the ability to get people on the ground, field crews properly trained, etc., that's kind of followed right along with that.
Yeah, Bill, and to dovetail off that, getting right butts, right seats. A lot of times, whenever I'm working with the utility, they're in a small rural area. Finding that right person is the hard part. And
Yeah.
so, partnering with someone who can help hold your hand in a way until you find that right person. That's one of the main keys that we have seen is, you don't want to just hire the first person or the first person that says they have web experience, just because they're the only person that you got to recruit, or you got a lead on that had something to do with the internet.
No,
You know,
and that's absolutely right. I mean, I've been on projects where you had to acquire a building that would hold 400 people, staff it, find the resources, get them there, get them trained, build, all the infrastructure to power that kind of a large engineering and construction operation. And today we're doing that relatively quickly and relatively virtually, even on the construction side, where you're able to get contractors from lots of geographies interested because you've got a structure in place where they can go right to work. They don't go through this difficulty of getting mobilized and having a lag time to start work. So
exactly.
It's such an important point, and I think about that, and I wonder, does it factor into your cost modeling for a candidate network when you're looking at a new area? Are you thinking, boy, I do or I don't have to build a warehouse to train 400 people? Or are those kinds of calculations not coming into your initial plan when you're trying to fund that network?
yeah, no, that's true. That's true. I mean, it's a factor, and it's a factor in how you get started, and then what is your evolution as a business. And it's always a challenge when you start, whether it's a small, 5,000 home project or whether it's a bigger project. You don't want to spend your time building the engineering and construction organization. What you want to do is spend your time building the customer-focused organization, so to rapidly bring the right planning and design resources in, and to rapidly mobilize construction crews and not be overly focused on kind of self-creation of all that. You want to create what is the long-term business.
Yeah,
Such-
yeah, that's perfect. I mean, that's why we hope to, when we first get started in the feasibility study, we're taking those factors into account. So what's the going rate for employees? What month are we going to bring them on so that we can actually financially calculate what that's going to do to the business? So every utility that's done for broadband, or every company that's done broadband, they've all started with a feasibility study. And so that's something that we provide, is we will do that feasibility study. And we take those factors into consideration, whether it be, like I said, what month are they going to start? How many techs are you going to start? How many CSRs, construction, management, it's all included in it should be all included in that feasibility study, because that's the only way to see if this project for you is feasible or not.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the factors that, when you think of the funding of these kind of projects, the most important thing is those folks that are funding it, no matter what the source, what they really want is predictability. You're going to build a business plan at the beginning that's going to make all these assumptions about take rate, cost, everything else. And you make those assumptions, informed assumptions. But when it comes down to it and you start the planning and design and everything else, you want predictability. You start a design process, you want to say, okay, I think I can bang out my high level design in a certain number of weeks. And when that happens, that just feeds everything downstream of being a predictable deployment.
So do you guys find that you look at things that you might not have before, whether it's, we put up a couple examples there, remote stalking, pre-terminated cable, because of these field level considerations, or do you guys, are you finding that you can plan well enough that you can continue with this sort of more traditional deployment methods?
So I'll speak to that directly. I know Irby, we're a distributor. That's what we do. We buy materials and we sell materials. That's what we do.
Yeah.
But what we've come into starting to look at, and it goes right to your point here, is we're now going ahead and making up pre-terminated drops, pre-terminated, whether that be for in-house or for clients for their home installs. There's a huge need for that, and the market isn't keeping up with that. So that's a source of, it's not a source of revenue technically for us, but it's a source of availability. Because if you want to talk about, costs and what's expensive, what's really expensive is if you have to stop construction. That's where the real costs hit you. If you have to stop construction and your crews go to another job, or they sit stagnant for a week, that's when the dollars really add up.
That's right. That's right. And again, it gets back to this issue of predictability, and to the extent that you can remove the unpredictable, whether it's, pre-terminated cables or whatever the item is, but removing that predictability really helps.
So Harley, if you were to build a planning engine, a planning tool, how would you factor in some of these mission critical aspects, considerations that the gentlemen have been discussing?
Yeah, so I really think that there's really two big impacts that we can make here. And it kind of goes back to your point, your oxymoron earlier, Russell, around a good plan not existing. So by leveraging software specifically, we can start to investigate what are some of these optical technologies that can really reduce material cost, but also allow your crew to work faster in the field to get homes connected. once you've got that sort of design, you can then use some new technologies in software to apply your crews to your network in a way that sort of maximizes your revenue by reducing the time to market.
And what a fantastic segue that is, because we are going to next go into our first of two polls today. So you, the audience, are going to provide a little bit of content for us. So over the next 30 seconds or so, we're going to give you the option to provide us your thoughts on how much of your planning work actually goes into the final design, the actual engineering. So you'll be guys sad to hear that none of the panelists can vote. So no fingers are on no thumbs are on the scale here. But very interested to hear what the audience has to say on this matter. And I'm hearing two very, very important buzzwords, which is predictability. You want to know and remove ambiguity from your design as much as possible, and do not stop construction. That's fascinating. So we'd had a small discussion on the panel about what we thought the number would be, but here we see very clearly that that you guys really are doing a good job of taking the data that you're using on the planning stage and carrying that forward into the actual design. I suspect you guys are over-indexing a lot of the industry on how much of this is true. So kudos to you. Well done. So we'll get to the next of our obstacles/opportunities, and that's pathways. Where are you actually putting the fiber as you're going from the central office, from the hut out to the home? And we all are very familiar with some of the problems here. Where are the poles? How good are they, especially at the planning stage? How reliable are my assumptions going to be? And if we are able to take those data and actually start to model, it's a real opportunity for us to make sure that we've got a network that is going to be good for us as well as our investors in the long run. I just want to point out there was another FBA survey that was done a little while ago, and they found that in some parts of the country, an aerial deployment could be 5 times cheaper than an underground deployment. So it's a very glib question, but if that's true, why aren't all FTTX networks 100% aerial? I think we know why, but I'll lead off with Sam. Sam, how do you look at this, given the deep relationship you've got with utilities industry and the work that you do in a lot of rural areas? How do you approach modeling pole availability and aerial into yours, and what drives you underground when you do go underground?
Yeah, I mean, the utilities have a distinct advantage, and that's that they own the poles. So number one, there's no pole attachment fees. Number two, they can get up past the comm space if they're using ADSS. And so they're not having to do nearly the make ready that an incumbent utility or broadband provider would have to do, because they would have to pay the utility to raise poles or whatever it might be in order to make sure that they meet ordinances and the rules that they have to for clearances. A utility utilizing ADSS can be 6 inches below the neutral, up above the comm space, which eliminates a lot of that. And so that's some of the advantages that the utility has. They own the infrastructure. They don't have to go in the comm space. And so there's a lot of avoided costs, and specifically the make ready. The make ready is a huge cost for somebody who doesn't own the infrastructure whenever they try to come into that comm space. If they don't meet the height requirements, that make ready cost can be 10-15% of their entire project. We set ours when we're working with the utility because they're able to take advantage of those certain aspects of it, we're looking at less than 1% make ready is what we're looking at. And the poles that they are replacing were probably 1938 poles whenever they got when they got installed back in the day. So they needed to be replaced anyways.
So why would your customers ever go? Why would your partners ever go underground? Because I think they do occasionally, right?
Yeah, they do. There's definitely areas, if they're trying to go through neighborhoods, some neighborhoods don't allow overhead lines. They want underground, and in that case, they're going underground. For if there's a certain area that's more natural disaster territory, and they feel like it's safer underground, they can certainly go underground as well. We haven't seen the widespread cost that the Fiber Association saw 5 times. I think that might be a little high for what we've seen, but it is probably I would say closer to 2 to 3 times the cost. So that's a lot of it is trying to get in through neighborhoods or get around poles that they don't own. If they're working and going in through a city and the IOU owns the infrastructure there, a lot of times they're going underground in those cases.
And do you feel like you're able to catch those differences at the feasibility stage, at the planning stage?
Absolutely. So, whenever we when we get a design back from Biari, we're actually building that into the design. So we're sending them where the utilities lines are. So we already pretty well know what areas are going to be overhead and what areas are going to be underground.
Right.
And normally it's 80 to 85% aerial, and then 20% underground. But that does make a big difference, especially on these huge builds. Because soil conditions is really what plays into that. Now, if we're in a very rocky territory, I would say the 5 times the cost of overhead is low.
Right.
If you're having to bore through granite the whole time, it's going to take quite a bit to get through that. So it really depends on the soil condition as well.
Yeah. Bill, I'm going to take a stab here and guess that you have slightly more than 1% make ready engineering for a lot of the work that you're doing, given that you have a
Well, I
sliver.
mean, in this, mega project in Florida and Georgia, it's all underground.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
We acquired some pieces that are aerial, and we're using that right now, but we're planning to replace it as we execute the build. But I would say that the experience with the Biari planning process and engineering process, the one huge advantage is that we've seen in developing other projects that contractors and people that are on the ground trying to, build the network, they will say, well, there is a cost difference. You can debate what that amount is, and eventually you get to a real number, but you
Right.
have a time issue that can be, basically the tipping point, because in some cases, you sit down with the utility and say, okay, here is our network plan, and you overlay that with their utility plan. And ideally, what we would like to try through that process to do is that many of the areas where we're planning networks, the electric utility is planning to push their infrastructure underground.
Mm.
So we definitely don't want to be trying to get on poles that are on the schedule to be replaced by underground plant in 5 years. So through having a good planning exercise, we can sit down and say, okay, well, we see these neighborhoods, you're already slated to push that underground. We don't want to, try to get on those poles and do make ready, et cetera. So that's a big factor in some of the communities we're seeing, because a lot of these communities, were built a long time ago. The poles need to be replaced. And in some of them, they're pushing them underground. So,
Yeah. And it's such an important point because there are a variety of partnering options you can get into if you have an idea of really at the planning stage, at the feasibility stage, if you can go to a municipality or a power company or whoever it might be and say, well, there's a give and take here. Given that the most expensive part of any network is the deployment, if we're adding pathways, if we're putting other things in, that can be to everyone's advantage and really help out with the total installed cost.
absolutely.
Harley, I'm interested when people look at different deployment options. How does that affect the reliability of a plan? Do you find that there's more or less predictability and accuracy if they deploy one way versus another?
Yeah, definitely. And, as was discussed, I think there is a really high cost up front to construct your network, and you are trying to balance, the cost savings of going aerial versus the predictability of going underground. While you can deploy faster and perhaps cheaper upfront with aerial, some of the factors that we've discussed, like pole applications, ownership, telco space, they can make it really, really difficult to, it can be really difficult to get that right up front in your plan and have that carry through to your design and construction.
So I think this carries into the next and last of our P's in the opportunities and challenges of the world, which is permits. And well, I tell you, this is I think everyone agrees, the least scalable aspect of any large FTTH deployment. People that you don't employ are really determining the pace of your rollout, and they're doing it on their own timeline. And as Bill had pointed out earlier, it's not just permits, it's the 811 stuff. It's making sure that those crews are not held up by some of the paperwork involved in a deployment. And so as I'm thinking about this, Sam, I know for you, permit doesn't fall directly into your day-to-day work on the feasibility and the planning side. Does it factor at all for any of your customers at the beginning stages?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Our construction teams are working on permits every day.
Yeah.
And especially whenever they're getting in the beginning, we're also looking at whenever we're doing the feasibility level designs, we're actually even taking a step further. Normally, who's the worst person to deal with when it comes to permits? I think everybody can kind of say railroads. That seems to be the big one. And so we're looking at railroad crossings. Where can we not do it? And so that's what we're building is where can we not put this? So we're absolutely taking those, it may not necessarily be a permit, but we're avoiding a permit by making those changes. With the utilities that we deal with, most of them already have right of way or permits within their electric footprint. Now, what the utility has to really look at is, does that include broadband service? And a lot of times it doesn't. And so they would have to go back to those co-op members or IOU customers, and they would have to actively update those permits. And I know the case where I'm from in Illinois, a lot of solar is going on up there, and for solar permits, they're paying quite a bit of cash to the farmers to get those permits. So when the utility comes to them and asks for them to update their permit, they're not paying anything. So it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder ask.
Yeah, that well is dry.
Yeah.
So Bill, again, what's fascinating about our panelists, such different sort of backgrounds and experiences. Again, you guys are doing tens, hundreds of thousands of homes. How does permitting factor into your planning for different areas? How do you approach where you should be building?
Well, it is a day-to-day battle getting permits, and the advantage, for example, that we're finding in using a BRE solution to do feasibility and high-level design and continuing to push that forward is to identify early in the project critical things that have to be permitted. State highway crossings are a natural. And you can see, we can go through a traditional design process and you could be weeks or months into that process before the designer bumps into, well, I need to cross this highway. I can only cross it 1 or 2 times before I create a problem. If
Yeah.
I go in with a BRE feasibility design, I can identify almost all of those within weeks of having a go to get that work done. And as you progress through that, we're now on a very large project at the phase where we're trying to say, okay, we're not quite done with the design, but we can identify literally a dozen critical crossings that we can go ahead and permit right now and get those underway well before we've even finished the design. So
Right.
it's a huge deal.
Harley, when you're taking feedback from the marketplace, you're taking feedback from regulators, from our customers, and you're thinking about equipping a design engine to factor in permits and things like that. What are some of the more interesting or more challenging aspects of making sure that that's useful for end users?
Yeah, I think the main thing is that you really need to plan to permit. And when I look at our approach and how we've done this in the past, like making sure that you're prioritizing the parts of your project that are going to be more challenging. So getting those started up front, looking at the routes, and really trying to mitigate how often you need to permit is really a big challenge. And then when we look at business case modeling and projecting revenue and allocation of resources in the field, if you can identify that up front in your modeling, and I think an ideal engine here would be able to build those expiration dates, moratoriums into your cash flow projections to ensure they've been taken into account.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So your model looks at not just at the cost of aerial versus underground, the number of splitters where you're putting in slack, but your model is also saying permits are going to have an expiration date in one area sooner than another. So you should be factoring that into your calculations.
Yeah, either into your calculations or your process, ideally both.
Yeah, we all know that the communities, while they want you to build the network, they also want to minimize the disruption at the beginning. So a lot of communities are, only letting a certain amount of network road work, if you will, or network construction sites to be open at a given time. So you've got to close those, do the repair work before you're really allowed to start another permitted area. So even though you might go into these projects and have a certain amount of work permitted, there's a throttle on how much of those permits can have active construction at a time.
So many inputs to doing this well. So many plates you got to keep in the air. And as we get beyond our 3 Ps and start looking at cracking the code on FTTX funding, we are absolutely seeing that whereas 10 years ago, 15 years ago, your design, your business development, your grant applications, those might have been efforts that had worked at 100,000 homes, 100 homes at a time, maybe a couple thousand homes at a time. But we are absolutely seeing a lot of people in the industry designing hundreds of thousands of homes at a swoop. The scale of the number of homes being considered by a variety of players has absolutely gone through the roof. And it's very interesting to note that this is completely impossible to do by hand or a lot of the old traditional ways. And more to the point, as you're leveraging design technologies, you now have the ability to actually start looking at the individual houses within an area and getting an early view of which ones you should be talking to the first. You should be really trying to make the network pay for itself as quickly as possible. So, Bill, just one question. When you guys look at where the new networks are going, are you still using the same old rules? How are you looking at what new areas to cover, and how are you, what's
Well,
different from what you might have done 10 years ago?
Yeah, we're tending to look at new areas in buckets of, 5 to 10,000 homes.
Yeah.
And we also, though, look carefully at the demographics and the mix of MDUs and commercial locations, et cetera. And while the business at its essence is typically built on single family homes, and you'd like to get to the best targeted versions of those, we also recognize that the revenue associated with going to commercial areas can be huge.
Yeah.
And you're building this very powerful network. It's a lot different than a cable company that says, yeah, I've got cable out there, et cetera, and I've got some business services, but they don't have the ability to provide the kind of business services you can provision a fiber network for. So we're certainly not ignoring these tracks of commercial locations. So it's a combination of finding the best homes, finding these commercial locations, and frankly, through a good planning tool, though, you can say, okay, our connection to the rest of our network is at point X, whether that's a cabinet or other facility. The first home we want to serve is the one right next door. So, we try to follow the path of light. As you light the network, you're lighting up customers.
Yeah, Russell, I would give an example of a electric cooperative that we built out a couple of years ago. Small rural co-op, only about 8,500 to 9,000 members. They actually ended up building to the city that the co-op surrounded the non-member territory first, in order to get that ARPU and that payback built up and ready. So I mean, they were able to build that system, which almost added a third of their customers, because that was a town of about 3,000 in a small territory, and they were able to take those funds and build out to members that weren't going to get it if they didn't do it, and or they weren't going to get it for many years until the system was paid back. So that CEO really went out on a line, and I don't think many would take that aspect to serve non-members first, but that's what it took for them to make their project feasible.
What's interesting is that I know that Harley and some of the team have been working on some capabilities to make everyone look a little bit more like the CEO of that co-op. And so, Harley, if you don't mind, I want to just go to a little bit of work that you were putting together on some financial planning capabilities to address these very questions.
Yeah, so first of all, if I could replicate that CEO's decision making in here, I would love it, But having a more methodical approach, which you need to have with automation to at least give the basis to start making those decisions, there's really 3 points that I'd want to talk about. So when I evaluate, when I look at a market, which customers do I want to serve and which ones should I onboard first? That's the first question. And you're going to need some way of evaluating what's the value of a subscriber or a connection. And you don't necessarily need to do that with an ROI model, but an ROI model is really good in the way that you're going to have a better understanding of how successful your project can be, while also understanding which addresses you should connect first. Because, if high value areas, like, if there's a higher chance of take rate, or, a commercial area, you know, you can start to really easily justify those decisions based on your plan up front. And then I think the second aspect here, location, you know, it's nice to think of things, I guess, like geographically, but unfortunately, we can't always build a network as the crow flies. So taking into account the actual path required to get to that service location is an important factor there as well. And then the final point, justification. You know, how can I explain how I've made these decisions? You know, I'm interested to see the justification for going non-members first, but it's worked out. Yeah, so, you know, can I provide any reporting? What data do I need? You know, I've seen requirements on having, to access funding, you need to have routes and bill of materials and the right reporting. So yeah, that's what I mean by justification there. Next slide, please. And then, yeah, bringing this all into a business case model where you can assess the value, the costs, the risks, and have sort of like a main deliverable that you can communicate to stakeholders, will allow you to prioritize your markets and neighborhoods and really take into account these 3 Ps to make sure that your plan going forward is the best one you can propose.
And this goes straight back to Bill's point earlier about predictability and establishing a relationship between the service provider and the funding authority, whoever they might be. And being able to provide this level of detail at the outset, I think, is one of the most important things you can do, whether, again, you're trying to get your capital from your board of directors, from a new investor, or from some government or state agency. This all brings us into, I'm happy to report, our next poll. So again, everyone attending, you have a quick 30 seconds to help figure out which of these is the least predictable component in your FTTH plan. And we've taken some guesses on the panelists' side. Again, we cannot put our thumb on the scale, but we have a point of view on what we think you guys are going to come back with. Be very interested to see if our horse sense is correct here. And drum roll, please. Total installed cost, we thought, was going to be the biggest factor here, but take rate and competitors beating me to the market. I think those two are somewhat synonymous. So it's maybe a not perfectly worded poll, but super interesting to see. Super interesting to see, and very informative from my point of view. I thought at least someone would have said total installed costs. So, you know, live and learn. So let's wrap up our wonderful discussion today. And before we get into the takeaways, I'd like to recount a super interesting anecdote that was in the Fierce Telecom, one of the trade publications recently. And they told the story about how in 2015, AT&T made a deal with the FCC that in order for AT&T to have the right to purchase DirecTV, they would pass 14 million homes with fiber. And here we are 9 years later, and those 14 million homes are worth more than DirecTV. So I think what it goes to show is that this is a long-term investment with long-term value, and everything that we're doing today has a very real long-term horizon for profitability. And it's going to behoove each and every one of us to do this correctly from the outset. So if we're looking to crack the code on funding, it's really, again, get it right as you can from the start. Plan thoroughly. leverage the new technologies that are available. And please, as over half of you have already learned, use the data that you're putting together in the feasibility and the planning stage. Make sure it's good enough that it's informing and participating in your actual final engineering and design. So before we go to question and answer, I'll just turn the floor back over to Bill and to Sam and to Harley. Gentlemen, any last comments before we wrap up for the day?
You know, my last comment would, be, no project gets started without a study and without a business plan. And
That's
so you can't know the financials, you can't know the take rate, you can't know any of that until you look to see what it's going to cost and if it's going to be beneficial.
right.
And so that's something that we at Irby have partnered with Biari, and I think we've done a fantastic job. And Biari's done a fantastic job going ahead and showing utilities and ISPs what it would cost to either start brownfield or go greenfield and go brand new. So
Mhm. Yeah, I would just go back and reiterate the same point is that if you put together your business plan and the next step is you're looking at feasibility planning for specific areas, you create the kind of predictability, you create the kinds of bills of material that contractors can build pricing around. So you close all those risks, if you will, of the cost, the deployment, and even the schedule side of it, and focus on, the hard things, which that's really the lesson in all this is as much as you can make things predictable and routine, there'll be plenty of fires to fight every day that you don't have to spend time doing those other things.
That's it. Extremely well put. Harley, my friend, as we finish up, any words of wisdom for the crew?
Oh, I suppose, yeah, you just really want to reduce risk and communicate value. That's my 2 pointers. And making these decisions up front, it can become a fulfilling prophecy. If I can start to identify which sections of the market I'm going to access when, I can prioritize them, boost that take rate, and get in there.
So we've got 2 quick questions, and I'll take one, and I'll take the first and aim it at both Sam and Bill, which is: have you all used any new technologies to help with field work? Thinking of LiDAR for pole assessments, things like that. Bill?
I have not used that. I've been enamored with the possibility and the technology and would love to try.
So,
Great.
so we've looked at it. We've looked at doing it. We actually started up a GIS department, and that was one of the first things that they really wanted to try to stand up. Whenever we're doing a build out, you're doing a low level design or a walkout already. So
Right.
we couldn't swing or didn't see the advantages of doing something like that, but that's not to say that costs don't change and it would be advantageous in the future.
Okay, well, I'll summarize that as not yet, but willing to try, if it makes sense.
Well, I would say that we are fascinated by folks that are rolling out the capability to do at least a very first kind of fielding exercise in an automated fashion.
Sure.
They're using vehicles, they're quickly canvassing and collecting data, and the actual people on the ground is kind of a cleanup exercise. We have looked at some of that. It's we haven't actually tried it yet, but it's very interesting.
Right. Interesting. And the next question I'm going to route first to Harley. What if my grant carves out how I can use funds for non-eligible households? I think what this question is getting at is if I've got a grant that dedicates the infrastructure for specific underserved or unserved addresses, how do I layer that in? Am I able to layer that into a broader design?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess reusing assets to deliver to underserved, unserved, and served addresses is really the challenge, right? So, if there's time requirements on your funding, those can be built into your build out strategy. And, you can assess what's the most ideal way to get to those locations within your requirements, whilst also, identifying opportunities along the way.
Mhm.
Fascinating. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our webinar today. I'd love to extend another heartfelt thanks to our panelists for their time and their expertise. Thank you very much. Anyone who has any questions that we weren't able to address, feel free to send them in. I believe we'll be sharing the contact information for everyone on the panel today, to anyone who did participate in the webinar. So thank you very much for your time and happy deploying to everyone on the call. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.